When love dies, the vacuum left behind becomes fertile ground for evil to grow. You see, love is not just an emotion, it is a foundation. It is the force that holds families together, the glue that strengthens communities, the balm that heals broken hearts, and the compass that keeps humanity pointed toward compassion. When love is alive, it regulates us. It teaches us patience, it teaches us forgiveness, it softens our pride, and it compels us to reach beyond ourselves. But when love dies, when it is choked out by neglect, rejection, bitterness, or hatred, the emptiness does not remain empty for long. The soul cannot exist in a vacuum. Something will always fill the space that love once occupied, and more often than not, that something is destructive. When love dies between a husband and a wife, resentment begins to grow like weeds in a neglected garden. The laughter that once echoed through the house is replaced by silence, or worse, by arguments that tear through the atmosphere like storms. When love dies in a family, children become casualties of coldness, and generational cycles of pain begin to spin faster and faster. When love dies in a society, people no longer see one another as neighbors, but as competitors, enemies, strangers to be feared and obstacles to be removed. This is the fertile soil where evil plants its seeds. Evil does not start as an explosion, it starts as a whisper. It begins in the cracks where love has been allowed to decay, in the heart that once forgave quickly but now clings to grudges, in the person who once reached out a hand but now pulls it back in suspicion, in the community that once opened its doors but now builds walls. That is how evil germinates, through the absence of love. It spreads slowly but steadily until what was once unthinkable becomes normal. Division becomes expected. Cruelty becomes justified. Violence becomes entertainment. And before we realize it, we are living in a world where love is not only absent, it is despised, where compassion is mocked, where mercy is seen as weakness. Think about the wars that have scarred our history, the genocides that have wiped out entire generations, the betrayals that have destroyed friendships, the injustices that have crushed the oppressed. None of these sprang forth simply because evil was powerful, but because love had been silenced. It was ignored, dismissed, and eventually starved to death. Love is the guardian, but when the guardian is removed, the enemy marches in with ease. That's why the death of love is so dangerous, because it clears the way for evil to reign without resistance. Evil flourishes in emptiness. A person without love becomes vulnerable to anger, hatred, greed, jealousy, and pride. These vices do not need much encouragement. They only need a little space. And when love is absent, that space becomes endless. A heart without love becomes a breeding ground for bitterness, and bitterness, when left unchecked, transforms into vengeance. A community without love turns into a battlefield where suspicion, division, and fear dominate every interaction. A nation without love becomes a machine that feeds on its own people, valuing power over humanity, wealth over justice, and control over compassion. Love's death is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. Sometimes it dies not with an explosion, but with neglect. We stop calling when we should call. We stop forgiving when we should forgive. We stop giving when we should give. And little by little, love shrinks until it can no longer be found. That is when evil begins to write the story. Evil loves to step into abandoned spaces. Where there is no kindness, cruelty enters. Where there is no empathy, apathy reigns. Where there is no forgiveness, grudges take root. Where there is no compassion, hatred rules. Evil thrives not because it is powerful, but because love has been dethroned. The most dangerous thing about the death of love is that it is often invisible at first. People can smile and shake hands while love has already died inside of them. Families can sit at the same dinner table while love has already been buried in their hearts. Churches can gather every Sunday while love has already been replaced with pride, ego, and tradition. Nations can shout slogans of unity while secretly strangling the very love that makes unity possible. And all the while, evil is waiting, patient and cunning, ready to grow in the soil that love abandoned. That is why it is not enough to talk about love. It must be protected, nurtured, and fed. Because when it dies, something else is born, and that something is not neutral. It is evil. The world is not destroyed by the presence of evil alone, but by the absence of love that once stood against it. It is the neglect of love that gives rise to hatred. It is the rejection of love that births cruelty. It is the silencing of love that invites chaos. Love is a shield. It is a guardrail. It is a foundation. And when that shield is broken, when that foundation crumbles, when that guardrail is removed, evil rushes in to take possession. That is why the death of love is never silent in its consequences, even if it is silent in its beginning. It always leaves behind a trail of destruction. It always births to something dark, something hostile, something toxic. And the longer love remains dead, the stronger evil becomes, feeding on the emptiness, multiplying in the vacuum until it dominates the entire atmosphere, and what was once a fertile garden of compassion becomes a wasteland of bitterness, anger, and strife. Consider a child growing up without love. That child may survive, but survival without love is survival in the desert. They grow thirsty for affirmation, desperate for attention, hungry for acceptance. And if love is not poured into them, something else will be. Anger will step in. Rebellion will fill the void. Violence will seem like power, and hatred will feel like belonging. That is how gangs are formed, how prisons are filled, how cycles of abuse continue from one generation to the next. The absence of love becomes the invitation for evil to build its kingdom. Even in our personal lives, when love dies, evil grows silently. When love for ourselves dies, insecurity begins to speak louder, shame and guilt take over. We allow toxic voices to define us, and we accept chains that were never meant to be ours. When love for others dies, we start treating people like objects instead of souls. We begin to gossip, to betray, to compete, to tear down. Instead of lifting up, when love for God dies, we lose our anchor. We drift into selfishness, arrogance, and rebellion. That void will not remain empty. It will be filled. And what fills, it will not be life. it will be destruction. The absence of compassion forms hearts into weapons and communities into battlegrounds. Compassion is more than just a fleeting feeling of pity or a soft emotion of kindness. It is the very heartbeat of humanity. It is the power that allows us to see beyond ourselves, to feel the pain of another, and to step into their shoes with empathy and understanding. When compassion lives, it humanizes us. It softens the edges of our pride. It humbles our arrogance. It interrupts our selfishness. And it reminds us that life is not just about what we can gain, but also about what we can give. Compassion is what keeps us human in a world that often pushes us toward being cold, hardened, and detached. But when compassion dies, when it is silenced by indifference or strangled by apathy, the vacuum it leaves does not remain neutral. It transforms people into instruments of harm and entire societies into arenas of conflict. A heart without compassion becomes dangerous. Without compassion, we no longer feel the sting of another person's suffering. We no longer see the tears of the broken, the cries of the oppressed, or the hunger of the poor as our concern. Instead, we close our eyes, we turn our heads, we harden our hearts. And when the heart is hardened, it does not merely become indifferent, it becomes sharp, weaponized, and capable of cruelty. Without compassion, people justify acts of hatred, violence, and betrayal because they can no longer sense the humanity in the other. Compassion is the bridge between people. But when that bridge collapses, all that remains are islands of isolation, suspicion, and hostility. In communities, the absence of compassion is devastating. Where compassion is missing, division thrives. Neighbors stop seeing each other as allies and begin to see each other as rivals. People become quick to judge and slow to forgive. The atmosphere shifts from cooperation to competition, from peace to strife. Schools become places where bullying runs unchecked because compassion has been stripped away. Workplaces become toxic battlegrounds where people climb over one another for success, blind to the struggles of their colleagues. Nations become divided by politics, race, class, and ideology, each group unwilling to extend compassion to the other, each side ready to demonize the other. Without compassion, communities no longer serve as places of safety and belonging. They turn into war zones of bitterness, anger, and resentment. The transformation is subtle at first. Compassion does not die overnight. It withers slowly when neglected. Every time we ignore someone's cry for help, every time we justify injustice because it doesn't affect us directly, every time we value comfort over conscience, compassion shrinks a little more. And as it shrinks, the walls between us grow taller. We start justify cruelty in the name of survival. We start to tolerate injustice as if it were normal. We begin to accept violence as a natural part of life. And once compassion has been silenced, the very thing that makes us capable of living in peace is gone. What is left behind is a battlefield where every person is out for themselves. Every interaction is marked by suspicion, and every opportunity for healing is replaced with hostility. Think about history. Some of the greatest atrocities were made possible not simply because evil men rose to power, but because ordinary people allowed their compassion to be shut down. They looked at suffering and decided it wasn't their concern. They turned away when their neighbors were oppressed. They convinced themselves that cruelty was acceptable as long as it did not directly affect them. When compassion dies in the hearts of the many, the few who spread evil find fertile ground to build their kingdoms. Without compassion, entire nations become complicit in injustice, turning a blind eye to suffering until the suffering becomes too great to ignore. The absence of compassion also distorts personal relationships. A marriage without compassion becomes a battleground of egos where each person fights to be heard, but no one listens. A friendship without compassion becomes a stage for betrayal where one person uses the other without regard for their feelings. A parent without compassion raises children who feel unseen, unheard, and unloved, and those children grow into adults who repeat the same cycle. Compassion is the oil that keeps relationships from grinding against each other until they break apart. Without it, every interaction becomes friction, every misunderstanding becomes a conflict, every difference becomes a war. When hearts lose compassion, they become capable of justifying things they would never have tolerated before. Cruel words become normal. Acts of violence become acceptable. The suffering of others becomes entertainment. Compassion is the barrier that keeps us from crossing into the territory of dehumanization. But once it is gone, we begin to treat people not as human beings, but as objects to be used, obstacles to be removed, or enemies to be destroyed. That is why the absence of compassion is so dangerous. It is not simply the absence of kindness. It is the breeding ground for cruelty. The world without compassion becomes cold and mechanical. Technology may advance, wealth may increase, but if compassion is absent, then progress only makes us more efficient in our cruelty. We invent better ways to exclude, faster ways to exploit, and stronger ways to dominate. Without compassion, a science loses its soul, politics loses its conscience, religion loses its heart, and humanity loses its way. Compassion is what gives meaning to progress, what turns achievement into service, and what transforms power into responsibility. Without it, all of these things collapse into tools of oppression. Even in our daily lives, the absence of compassion shows up in subtle but destructive ways. The driver who cuts someone off in traffic without regard for their safety. The employee who betrays a colleague to get ahead. The leader who ignores the cries of the vulnerable while protecting the interests of the powerful. The stranger who walks past someone in need without even a glance. These small moments may not seem catastrophic on their own, but together they form the culture of a society. A culture without compassion becomes a breeding ground for selfishness, hostility, and violence. The absence of compassion creates battlegrounds not only between people, but within people. A person without compassion for themselves becomes self-destructive, driven by shame, guilt, and self-hatred. They become at war with their own soul, unable to see their worth, unable to forgive themselves, unable to embrace grace. And when you are at war within yourself, it becomes easier to spread that war to others. The battles we fight internally eventually manifest externally. And when compassion is absent within, conflict becomes inevitable without. Compassion is what reminds us of our shared humanity. It whispers to us that the person in front of us, no matter how different, no matter how broken, is still worthy of love, respect, and dignity. Without that whisper, we raise our voices in anger, in judgment, in cruelty. Compassion makes us builders of peace, but without it, we become architects of conflict. It makes us healers of wounds, but without it, we become the ones who inflict them. It makes us nurturers of life, but without it, we become agents of destruction. And that is why when compassion dies, hearts are transformed into weapons and communities, into battlegrounds. Reviving love is the only antidote powerful enough to dismantle the rise of evil. Love is not weak. It is not fragile, and it is not passive. Real love is a force, a power, a shield, and a weapon against the destructive currents of hatred, bitterness, and division. Where laws fail, where rules collapse, where systems are corrupted, love still has the capacity to heal wounds that anger cannot touch, to bridge gaps that logic cannot span, and to transform hearts that punishment cannot reach. Love is the antidote, not because it simply opposes evil, but because it uproots it at its core. Evil feeds on emptiness, on brokenness, on hatred, but love starves evil by filling the void with compassion, with forgiveness, with mercy, and with grace. Reviving love is not just about rekindling feelings of affection. It is about breathing life into the very essence of humanity that evil seeks to destroy. Love has a way of rehumanizing those who have been dehumanized. It has a way of restoring dignity to those who have been stripped of it. It has a way of softening even the hardest hearts. You can argue with someone's beliefs. You can fight against someone's actions. But when love steps into the room, it changes the atmosphere. Love can do what threats cannot do. Love can reach where laws cannot reach. Love can heal wounds that medicine cannot touch. Love is the antidote because it is the only force strong enough to not only stop evil, but to transform the very ground in which evil thrives. When love is revived in an individual heart, everything begins to change. A person once consumed by bitterness suddenly finds the strength to forgive. A person once bound by hatred suddenly begins to see others enemies, but as fellow travelers in this fragile journey of life. Love transforms the inner world first, dismantling the toxic emotions that fuel evil actions. When you revive love inside, you dismantle the weapons that were forming in your own heart. The grudges begin to dissolve, the anger loses its grip, the jealousy begins to weaken. Love does not just cover up evil, it pulls it out by the root, because love and evil cannot coexist in the same soil. When love is revived in families, cycles of destruction are broken. Generational curses fueled by resentment, abuse, and neglect begin to lose their power. Children raised in an atmosphere of revived love grow up knowing they are valued, seen, and cherished, and that sense of worth becomes their armor against the lies of the world. Parents who revive love in their homes create environments where healing is possible, where mistakes do not define identity, and where reconciliation is stronger than division. Evil loves to enter through broken families, through the cracks of abandonment and rejection. But when love is revived, those cracks are sealed and evil is denied entry.